So let's talk about imaginary numbers. Now, you know that the square root of 81 is 9. And that's because 9 squared is 81, 9 times 9. But we saw something like this. We saw the square root of negative 81. And we said, well, what number squared would give me a negative 81? And if you do positive 9 times positive 9, you don't get negative 81. And if you do negative 9 times negative 9, you don't get negative 81. So what we said in the past was we said that this is not a real number, and that's true. But now we're going to learn that this is actually an imaginary number. So we have imaginary numbers that will help us find answers to equations. I like to think of Narn as Narnia, if anybody's familiar with the books, and Narnia is an imaginary land. So let's talk about it. What is an imaginary number? We denote it by the letter I. And the definition of I is that it is the square root of negative 1. Likewise, I squared is negative 1. Okay, so you need to remember these two things. I'm going to put this over here on the right-hand side. Okay, we're going to keep this handy because we're going to have to come back to it. So what you do is you say, hey, when I see a negative under a square root, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it into an I. I'm going to look at this as if it's the square root of negative 1 times 81. And I can split it up into two radicals. Square root of negative 1 times the square root of 81. And now the square root of negative 1, like we said just a minute ago, is I. And the square root of 81, well, we know that that is 9. So this is I times 9. And we're going to put them just like we do our variables with a coefficient. We're going to write it as 9i. Okay, so no longer do you just say not a real number. You're going to use the letter I. Let's look at one more example just to make sure that we understand. So if you see the square root of negative 25, there's a negative under a square root. We're going to split it up into the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 25. Square root of 25 is 5. Square root of negative 1 is I. So this is I times 5. And of course, we're going to write our answer, 5i. Just to make sure you understand, let's see if you can answer this one. Okay, you can pause this video for a second, see if you can work it out. And the square root of negative 64, we'll split it up into the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 64. Square root of negative 1 is I. Square root of 64 is 8. So my answer here is 8i. That's it.